So, where we want to look next here is at East Asia. And we've talked quite a bit about East Asia already in terms of the 20th century with the Communist Revolution in China, the Cold War battlefields in Vietnam, Korea, as well as, the genocide in Cambodia and during the Cold War. So, it's pretty safe to say that East Asia is the most hotly contested of the Cold War fronts. It is the most highly militarized area outside of Eastern Western Europe in the world during the later half of the 20th century. There, like we said, are several proxy wars between communism and the West, and there's massive financial and military investment by both sides. Now, for those states outside of China and its communist allies, the capitalist states in East Asia thrive very quickly and very early on after decolonization. Many of them build incredibly successful export economies focusing on consumer goods, especially electronics. And one of the reasons why they're able to thrive in this period is because during the Cold War, there is hundreds of billions of dollars of United States and Western money that is invested into Eastern Asia. It is one of the first areas in what we consider the global south of the third world that sees large scale Western um, foreign investment. You see, uh, you see U.S. corporations funnel billions and billions of dollars into Southeast Asia. I mean, that's still the case today. But on top of that, because of the militarization of East Asia, many of these states are able to grow and thrive under the protection of the United States military, which means they themselves are allowed to focus their rebuilding after decolonization on economic growth rather than having the demands of a large military to defend themselves, such as was the case in communist China or Vietnam. Now, the first state to experience this kind of economic turnaround is Japan. After World War II, because the fact that Japan is a very important military outpost in East Asia, because of its relative proximity to communist China and communist North Korea, communist Soviet Union, Japan is the centerpiece of Western diplomacy in East Asia. And they receive hundreds of billions of dollars in financial and economic support from the United States, as well as the benefits of, American military protection. And what they focus on in the years after World War II is culturally, Japan essentially foregoes their previous ideology of military expansion and the building of a imperial empire, and instead they focus on pacifism, nonviolence, and economic growth. And what happens in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s is that the Japanese economy comes roaring back to life in a way that pretty much is unheard of in human history. The zaibatsu, which are these government created monopolies that were granted under imperial Japan, now become privatized and they benefit tremendously from US investment and the umbrella of US military protection. And some of these former zaibatsus go on to become multinational global corporations. Mitsubishi, Toyota, Honda, and Kawasaki are all Japanese corporations that start out as these zaibatsu monopolies granted by the government, right? So this chart gives you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of this, what's called post-war economic miracle. The growth in GDP, or gross domestic product, essentially what a state has the ability to produce, um, more than grows roughly at a rate of about 16% per year in Japan after World War II. You can see from the chart the massive drop off in the mid 1940s that coincides with the end of World War II. But within 25 years, by 1970, Japan has grown to approach the status of much larger states, mainly the United States. And by the early 1980s, Japan is the second most prosperous country in the world, second only to the production of the United States, which is absolutely phenomenal when you consider that the entire nation of Japan is roughly the size in terms of square mileage of a mid-sized US state like Nevada or Arizona. Now, that success in Japan directly influences the political situation in East Asia. The economic growth in Japan, combined with the disastrous economic growth in communist China and Korea, quickly allows the other states of Southeast Asia to make up their minds in terms of which model they're going to follow. And many of them very quickly align with the United States and build on Japan's model. And this is where you see the introduction of what's known as the four Asian tigers, or the four Asian dragons, meaning the states of Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And each of these states follows to the letter, maybe not politically, but economically, the growth model of Japan. They develop export economies focused on consumer goods with a heavy emphasis on electronics. And within 1 to 2 decades, all of them see unparalleled economic growth. And while they're seeing this, their communist neighbors are seeing economic stagnation or backsliding. So the trend that you see in East Asia during decolonization is that larger states that have a more agrarian population tend to gravitate towards communism and Soviet influence, because they are in desperate need of government planning in order to quickly industrialize their mainly agrarian population, right? This is part of the reason why China, North Korea, Vietnam, and Cambodia remain communist well into the 1970s and the 1980s. Um, in some cases, however, some states remain completely unaligned with either side of the Cold War. In many of these places, you have a strong nationalist political party or government that rejects any kind of Western or foreign influence. Um, and basically, because they are unaligned, they remain relatively unindustrialized, um, compared to, say, the four tigers. Now, this chart demonstrates what we're talking about in terms of economic growth across what's known as the four Asian tigers. Over the past 25 years, each of these economies has grown more than 6 or 7 times. And a lot of that comes from their own economic policy, but a lot of it also comes from foreign investment. Many of these countries benefit from the relocation of jobs out of the United States and other Western areas and into less developed countries where labor regulations are not quite as tight and where bigger corporate profits can be pursued. Now, For the most part, the capitalist states in East Asia vastly outperform the communist states. Economically, they're more politically stable. The standard of living is significantly higher. Like we said on the last slide, the violence and instability of most of the communist states in Southeast Asia also convinces many people that communism is not a real viable alternative. Now, some of that starts to see a change after Mao's death in China in 1976, I believe. In China, they begin to follow a new economic model where the Communist Party retains its political leadership. It maintains a high level of authoritarian control, but they open China up economically to the global marketplace, to foreign investment, to private individual business. And following China's lead, most of the other communist states, minus North Korea, um, pretty quickly fall in line. Beyond that, as the Cold War starts to wind to an end and the Soviet Union collapses, communist ideology basically falls away in East Asia. Most of the East Asian countries follow the model of the Asian tigers with rapid industrialization, um, heavy foreign investment, especially from US corporations who move their manufacturing to these areas. And to differing degrees, they fall in line politically, usually either with the United States or with China. So you see some constitutional republics similar to the United States. You see some authoritarian states similar to China. You see some military dictatorships, single party democracy. Um, but the political situation is relatively more stable in East Asia than in any other decolonized area. And because of that significant economic growth, by the 1970s, East Asia has basically supplanted the United States as the manufacturing center of the world. This is why when you go to Walmart and you look at the tags on things, for the most part, they are produced in some East Asian state. All right. Here you see some examples of that heavy foreign investment that we talked about. Major US corporations have a strong presence in East Asia, especially in China, thanks to the massive population. Um, Over a billion consumers can go a long way. Another way that you see foreign investment in East Asia is the transfer of manufacturing facilities to those states, generally because labor costs are significantly lower, production costs are significantly lower. Um, Everything from Nike to HP has a foothold in East Asia. And then this map gives you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of the economic production that is capable. Um, at this point, when this graphic was created in 2009, China had already surpassed Japan as the world's largest economy. And within 3 more years of this, they were in a position to challenge the United States in terms of um, gross domestic product. So, one of the big questions going forward is going to be, you know, which economic model, which political model is going to win out in terms of East Asia. For most of the history of this region, China has been the dominant political and cultural influence. And you can still see that in many places. However, post World War II, the United States and its status as the largest superpower in the world still has a pretty lasting influence on a lot of East Asian countries. So the next 20 to 50 years will be very decisive in terms of which model most of the Asian countries here are going to align themselves with? Are they going to align with democratic Western style capitalism, similar to the United States, or are they going to follow a more authoritarian style of capitalism, similar to China, where the government, while not socialist or communist, does still own and manage many of the major corporations within the country?